In 1862, the U.S. was at war. The Union and the Confederacy were deep in the throes of an intense civil war. Therefore, Lincoln's government paid little attention to a disadvantaged Sioux Indian nation attempting to use diplomatic strategies to feed their starving people and garner proper annuity payments promised by the U.S. government. This led to young, disenfranchised Sioux braves, anxious to prove themselves, to clash with settlers, ignorant of the nation's efforts to peacefully resolve their grievances. What started out as a relatively minor conflict drew to a head and not only threatened the region, but the security of the entire Union. The conflict that spanned several months would become known as the Dakota Uprising. The Sioux were a semi-nomadic tribe who followed the buffalo as the majestic animals grazed and roamed the American Midwest. Much of Sioux culture, spiritual beliefs, and dietary customs centered on the American bison. The indigenous peoples traveled from modern-day Minnesota to Montana and as far south as Colorado in search of the buffalo. The Sioux's wanderings led them to encounter travelers making their way west, looking for land to settle. Over time, the settlers' farms and towns impacted the migration routes, as well as the number of buffalo available to hunt. This led to armed conflicts between the Sioux and the settlers. Yet, in an act of two-sided diplomacy, the Traverse des Sioux Treaty was enacted. Tense meetings between representatives of the Sioux Nation and Indian agents, representatives of the U.S. government, began in earnest. The specifics of the treaty outlined the boundaries of the new reservation along with reserved land for hunting, to be located in Minnesota. The treaty also promised each member of the tribe would receive an annuity payment from the U.S. government. It went as far as to broker deals with local traders for select trading rights. The treaty was ratified by a delegation of Sioux in Washington, D.C. on July 23, 1851. Despite the good nature and optimism of the peace talks and the subsequent treaty, in a matter of months, the Sioux were once again forgotten. Left to starve on land where nothing grew, no animals grazed, clashes with settlers erupted as the settlers continued to encroach on their lands. Little Crow, a prominent Sioux war chief, spoke out in an attempt to bring the plight of his people back to the forefront of U.S. domestic policy. He sent several eloquent and diplomatic letters to regional Indian agents as well as the U.S. government requesting the government's assistance in feeding his people. Debates ensued within the Indian Nation and amongst government agents, not to mention between the Sioux and the federal agents. John R. Brown, a Minnesota Indian agent, attempted to squelch further violence by hashing out trading deals in recognition of the government's inability to pay annuities. Settlers, shop owners, and traders armed with anti-Indian biases and suspicions refused to sell or give credit on the goods the Sioux needed for fear the government would not reimburse them. Many influential and frustrated Sioux war chiefs abandoned the debates and threatened further violence. As the annuity system broke down, so did the good hope rhetoric of the fair treatment and diplomacy toward the Sioux, as illustrated by this terse comment made by prominent trader Andrew Myrick. Angered by such comments as Myrick's, young Sioux braves, under Little Crow's leadership, were now even more incensed and eager to go to war. On Sunday, August 17th, a small warring party of Sioux attacked Litchfield, Minnesota, killing 4 settlers. Later in the afternoon on the same day, Little Crow, now in the minority, capitulated to his war council to avoid an internal conflict. The next day, Monday, August 18th, a much larger war party of Sioux attacked the Redwood Agency, killing 44 settlers and capturing 10. A hastily assembled state militia was mobilized. The militia arrived at Redwood as the last of the Sioux warriors left the site of the latest massacre. Minnesota Governor Alexander Ramsey received the news about Redwood. Enraged, Ramsey put Colonel Henry H. Sibley, a competent leader but inexperienced soldier, in charge of quashing what the governor now perceived as a major Indian rebellion. On Tuesday, August 19th, the township of New Ulm was attacked. The Sioux descended on the town, killing men, women, and children alike. As quickly as they appeared, the Sioux warriors vanished, leaving the town razed, buildings burning, and 16 settlers dead. In the wake of the attack, survivors such as Helen Tarbell, later author of The Story of My Capture and Escape During the Minnesota Indian Massacre of 1862, as well as daily newspaper articles, convinced thousands of settlers to flee the region. Federal troops arrived and immediately clashed with the Sioux war parties. The bloodiest and most dramatic battles took place over the weeks following the federal troops' arrival. The Second Battle of New Ulm, an attack on Fort Ridgely, and most significantly, the Battle of Birch Coulee. Bolstered by significant wins on the battlefield and while the war raged on around him, Little Crow reached out to the settlers, Indian agents, and the U.S. government. In a final attempt at diplomacy, he once again outlined the events that precipitated the conflict in his opinion. With any hope of diplomacy vanquished, the Sioux witnessed unparalleled U.S. aggression. Federal forces made no distinction between warring and peaceful Sioux. The troops took hundreds of prisoners, even though an overwhelming majority of the Sioux opposed the war against the settlers. Correspondence reopened between the Sioux and Lincoln's administration as pro-U.S. Indian advocates called friendlies negotiated the release of innumerable settlers and troops, and ignored Colonel Sibley's indiscriminate capture of other Sioux men, women, and children. Although the U.S. held many of the Sioux as prisoner, Little Crow mounted one last major offensive known as the Battle of Wood Lake. Colonel Sibley effectively defeated the Sioux at Wood Lake, capturing over 800 warriors and thus ending the Dakota Uprising. Colonel Sibley immediately called for the capture and internment of the remaining Sioux warring parties. He created a committee to conduct a thorough assessment of the damages sustained during the 2 months of the conflict. The committee convicted some 300 Sioux to hang without due process. Bishop Henry Benjamin Whipple advocated for those Sioux that were truly innocent to be released. He forwarded a letter to President Lincoln addressing the illegal and ethical violations and implications if the hangings were to take place. Lincoln hesitantly stepped in, and subsequently the list was reduced from 300 to 38. The day after Christmas in 1862, 38 sovereign Sioux citizens were hanged for committing either murder or rape. Their families stood by and wept as hundreds of Minnesotan settlers cheered with relief. In 1862, Lincoln's separated families relocated thousands of Sioux to the Dakotas and imprisoned them in internment camps to subdue a proud yet struggling sovereign nation. What could have been a major victory for American diplomatic doctrine, foreign or domestic, became the epitome of failure in debate and diplomacy. For many in the U.S., the Indian-U.S. government conflict known as the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890 marked the end of the Indian problem for the country. This reality is far removed. The first Sioux were released from the Dakota internment camps at the turn of the century. Many say the Dakota Uprising marked the beginning of the Sioux struggle for equity, sovereignty, and self-determination. Now, 160 years later, the struggle for these inalienable rights, provided by dozens of treaties, continues to be trampled. Pitted against modern-day upheavals and political vice, the strength of debate and diplomacy, with its power to assuage people, runs as strong with all American Indians as it did with the Sioux in 1862.